Hello history lovers and welcome back to my channel. In today's video we will delve into the intriguing early life of arguably Henry VIII's most beloved wife, Queen Jane Seymour. What makes Jane's life so interesting is the sheer little we know of it. While her reign was relatively brief, she was still able to leave her mark on the Tudor era. Join me as I uncover the lesser-known chapters of Jane's life, exploring the circumstances that shaped her into the queen she would become. As with much of her early life, we don't know when Jane was born. However, it is thought that she was born around 1507 or 1508, as it is thought that she was 29 years old when she died, based off the amount of mourners she had. Jane was born to parents Sir John Seymour and Margaret Wentworth, and was one of 10 children and the eldest daughter, although not all 10 children would make it to adulthood. It is thought that Jane and her siblings were born at Wolfhall in Wiltshire. Jane was born into a wealthy family, but they were relatively powerless until Jane's marriage to the king. Jane's mother, Margaret, was first cousin to Elizabeth Boleyn and Edmund Howard, the parents of Queen Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Through her mother, Jane was also a descendant of King Edward III, and her mother was the half-cousin to Elizabeth Tilney, Countess of Surrey, who was a noted beauty. Thanks to their royal connections, the Seymours had over 100 manors in 19 counties and 5 castles. Nothing definitive is known of Jane's education. We know that she could read and write, and it was likely that she was educated by the family chaplain at Wolfhall. Elizabeth Norton believes there is evidence that Jane was able to read and write, and she had at least some understanding of French and perhaps a little Latin. Because of this, it is also thought that Jane had spent some time in France in the households of Mary Tudor and Queen Claude. This claim was also based on a portrait in the Louvre which was allegedly identified as Jane.
Allegedly.
However, it is most likely that she never left England. Either way, her education and intellect was nothing to that of her predecessors, Catherine and Anne. Jane's education was tailored more towards the skills that a gentlewoman would need in order to marry a man of her status and run a country estate, supervising a large household, so essentially accounting, cooking, diary management and needlework, the latter of which Jane excelled at. She would have used herbs for medicinal purposes, gone hunting, hawking, dancing, and played some musical instruments, as well as being educated in the way of religion. Jane adored horses and owned a poodle. Norton supports this view, saying this was the extent of Jane's education, and she received the solid teaching befitting a future country gentlewoman rather than that of a great lady in the making. In 1514, her older brother Edward Seymour was given the position of a page in the household of the Princess Mary Tudor, who was on her way to France to wed King Louis XII of France. Edward would have gone with Mary, however, he returned a few months later when King Louis died, and Mary returned to England. So Jane would have been apart from her brother for a few months. There is no record of how this impacted Jane, or even if it did at all. As far as I'm aware, Jane did not attend the Field with the Cloth of Gold in 1520, however her father Sir John did as part of King Henry VIII's retinue. Jane passed the usual age for marriage, and apart from one rumour, which again annoyingly I can neither confirm nor deny, there was no evidence of a match being sought for her, which I find very unusual for the time, as love was never a factor in these arrangements, or more accurately, business transactions. It has been suggested that maybe Jane didn't have a big enough dowry for an eligible match. However, I find this unlikely due to the Seymour family's wealth. It is commonly believed that Jane entered Catherine of Aragon's household as soon as she turned of age, but there is no evidence of this. Jane would later model her own reign off of Catherine's. Jane's mother Marjorie attended on Queen Catherine the same way that Elizabeth Howard, Lady Boleyn, did. They weren't regular ladies in waiting. However, they did attend on the Queen on important state occasions, and it may have been Marjorie who introduced Jane to Catherine on one of her visits. It is also possible that Sir Francis Bryan, Jane's half-second cousin, requested or supported a place for her, as he was a supporter of her later career. It is thought that Jane joined Queen Catherine's household in the late 1520s. If Jane had been in Catherine of Aragon's service, then it is very likely that she would get to know the Princess Mary, and she would have spent time with her cousin Anne Boleyn, who was also a maid of honour to the Queen. Jane would have been in a unique position to watch first-hand the downfall of Queen Catherine, the rise of Anne Boleyn, and then witness the fall of another queen. Jane would offer her sympathies to Catherine and later her friendship and motherhood to Catherine's daughter, Mary. The 11th of July 1531 was the last day that Catherine of Aragon saw her husband, as she was essentially exiled from court. It is unknown what happened to Jane, but Elizabeth Norton, Jane's biographer, believes that she stayed with Catherine as part of her entourage. But, on the other hand, my bae and favourite historian Alison Weir suggests that Jane had joined Anne's retinue. Either way, Jane's whereabouts from this point to Anne basically becoming queen are unknown. It is probable that Jane returned to Wolfhall during this time.
Really?
No, not really. I can't back that up.
By Christmas, Jane had most likely moved from Catherine's household to that of Anne Boleyn's, who was at this point reigning as queen, all except in title. Again, some may argue that Jane didn't join Anne until September 1535. On the 1st of January 1534, Henry VIII gave his customary New Year presents. And you'll never guess who got a prezi.
Present, please!
To be exact, it was noted that a Mistress Seymour received a present. Again, Weir and Norton clash on who actually received this gift, with Alison stating it was Jane, while Elizabeth argues that it was Jane's sister-in-law Anne Stanhope. However, Edward Seymour had his knighthood at this point, and so it would be more likely that if it was Anne Stanhope, she would have been referred to as lady rather than mistress. But again, it's not that simple, as this assumes that Edward and Anne were married in early 1533, which we just can't confirm. But I feel like it would be Jane. Otherwise, I'd be a bit miffed, wouldn't you? Like, you're trying to get me to be your mistress, but you don't buy me a present, but you get my sister-in-law one.
Coincidence? I think not!
On the 13th of October 1534, the Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis wrote a letter to Emperor Charles V where he noted the rise of Jane Seymour in the king's affection, and the slow decline and potentially a bit of panic on Anne's behalf. He writes, "Of late days Lord Rochford's wife has been banished the court because she has conspired with the concubine to procure the withdrawal from court of the young lady whom this king has been accustomed to serve, whose influence increases daily, while that of the concubine diminishes, which has already abated a good deal of her insolence. The said young lady has of late sent to the princess to tell her to be of good cheer, and that her troubles would sooner come to an end than she supposed, and that when the opportunity occurred, she would show herself true and devoted servant." According to the life of Jane Dormer, who was once a maid of honour to Queen Mary I, the Countess recounts she and her husband were approached by Sir Francis Bryan to suggest a match between Dormer's son and Jane Seymour in 1534. The Countess opposed the match, believing her son was too good for Jane.
Allegedly.
The Countess then arranged a marriage for her son elsewhere. There is no evidence to support Jane Dormer's account. However, it is certainly possible because of the lack of evidence, so it's just something to consider. On the 4th of September 1535, King Henry VIII, along with his wife and Queen Anne Boleyn, stayed at the Seymour family home of Wolfhall in Wiltshire for 6 days. Some cite this as when Henry and Jane's relationship starts. However, there is no evidence to support this either. In November 1535, both the courtiers and the Queen herself became aware of the King's intentions to pursue Mistress Seymour, much like he had done with Anne. Jane concealed her ambitions through a charming demeanour and calm temperament. Guys, can you just feel my frustration on how little we know about Jane Seymour? I just can't cope. Jane, like Anne before her, resisted the King's advances while professing a chaste devotion to him. By November, the French ambassador had already noticed the King's renewed affection. Jane employed tactics similar to those used by Anne years earlier, resisting the King's amorous pursuits and expressing her desire to wait until marriage. Nevertheless, her virtue did not deter her from accepting the lavish gifts that Henry bestowed upon her. Funny that, as Henry's affection for Anne Boleyn grew with each rejection, so did his fascination with Jane. The court observed this shift closely, especially because Jane was perceived as a staunch supporter of Catherine and the Princess Mary, although I guess it's Lady Mary at this point, making her a prime target for Anne Boleyn's enemies. It's the 29th of January 1536. The funeral of Catherine of Aragon had happened, and that afternoon Queen Anne Boleyn found Jane Seymour sitting on her husband's knee. The pregnant queen went into a frenzy, so much so that Jane was ushered out of the room out of fear of Anne miscarrying. Unfortunately, it was all too much, and later that evening, the Queen miscarried what appeared to be a male fetus. The Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis gives us a better insight into this event in a letter that he wrote to Emperor Charles V on the 10th of February 1536, recalling the event. He wrote, "On the day of the interment, the concubine had an abortion which seemed to be a male child, which she had not borne 3.5 months, at which the king has shown great distress. The said concubine wished to lay the blame on the Duke of Norfolk, whom she hates, saying he frightened her by bringing the news of the fall of the king had 6 days before. But it is well known that this is not the cause, for it was told her in a way that she should not be alarmed or attach much importance to it. Some think it was owing to her own incapacity to bear children, others to a fear that the king would treat her like the late queen, especially considering the treatment shown to a lady of the court named Mistress Seymour, to whom, as many say, he has lately made great presents." We can see Jane's rise in the king's affection. Now, this could be slightly embellished on Chapuis's part on the basis that he had formed an alliance with Jane's brothers, Edward and Thomas Seymour. The Seymour siblings were working together with Chapuis to help advise Jane and her dealings with the king.
Really?
No, not really. I can't back that up.
Right, idiot, yes.
But I think it's highly likely, and not being funny, Jane did not bat an eyelid at Anne's execution and hopped into her shoes and bed disturbingly quick. But I highly suspect that Jane would whisper doubts in the king's ear about Anne, as Anne had done about Catherine, and she probably whispered about Anne's heretical learnings. She wasn't a heretic, but she was alarmingly close. Whatever she did, it worked, as Henry had gone from defending his relationship with Anne to now entertaining criticism about his wife.
Coincidence? I think not!
After the news of the miscarriage, Henry VIII commented that, "I see that God will not give me male children." He then proceeded to complain and blame Anne, who was upset enough as it is. After all, as Eustace Chapuis put it, she had miscarried her saviour. A distraught Anne passed the blame back onto Henry and that wench Jane Seymour. I would imagine that it was about now that Anne truly knew how Catherine had felt, as it was becoming more and more apparent that her husband was potentially looking for another wife, which might be Jane. Henry would shower Jane with gifts and messages regularly, much to Anne's disgust. Anne couldn't afford to trust Jane and kept a close eye on her.
I'm watching you, Wazowski. Always watching.
Anne would on more than one occasion, using her right as mistress, lash out and even slap Jane. On one occasion, Jane received a locket containing the king's miniature from Henry. Jane pretentiously revealed it in the presence of Anne. However, Anne's jealousy fled, prompting her to forcefully snatch the locket from Jane's neck, resulting in an accidental cut on her own finger. The Life of Jane Dormer notes Anne's jealousy manifesting as scratching and by-blows between the Queen and her maid. In a separate account from the 17th century, it was recounted that Anne forcibly removed a necklace, a gift from Henry to Jane, from her rival's neck. Although it's difficult to envision them engaging in a physical altercation, Anne had a known tendency for sudden fits of temper. I'm sure that Anne wished to dismiss Jane from her service, but due to her own unstable position at court, she didn't take any action. In March 1536, during Henry's absence, he found the separation from Jane to be unbearable. Desiring to convey his affection, he persuaded Sir Nicholas Carew to deliver a heartfelt love letter and a purse of gold to Jane. Up until that moment, Jane had been willing to accept lavish gifts, but she allegedly had principled reluctance to accept money. Her aim was to prompt the king to reveal his true intentions. Jane responded by kissing the letter and returning it unopened to Sir Nicholas. She then dropped to her knees, entreating him to plead with the king on her behalf. She wished for the king to recognise her as a prudent gentlewoman, hailing from a reputable and honourable family, a woman of unimpeachable character, who treasured her honour above all else, an honour she would not compromise for any sum of money. If the king wished to send her a financial gift, she humbly asked that he wait until God blessed her with a husband to whom she could be married. Luckily for us, we have another insight from Chapuis on the event as he wrote about it on the 1st of April 1536 in another letter to Emperor Charles V. At this instant, the Marchioness had sent to me to say what Mr. Gelliot had already told me, that the king being lately in this town, and the young lady Mrs. Seymour, whom he serves at Greenwich, he sent her a purse full of sovereigns, and with it a letter, and that the young lady, after kissing the letter, returned it unopened to the messenger, and throwing herself, consider that she was a gentlewoman of God and honourable parents without reproach, and that she had no greater riches in the world than her honour, which she would not endure for 1,000 deaths, and that if he wished to make her some present in money, she begged it might be when God enabled her to make some honourable match. Henry, who held deeply conservative views regarding the virtuous conduct of women, even in his attempts to seduce them, was greatly pleased by this reaction. He made the decision to meet with Jane only when she was chaperoned by her family. To facilitate these encounters, she arranged with Cromwell that the minister to switch apartments with Edward Seymour, so that the king could visit her discreetly through a private corridor on a regular basis. Chapuis then continued, "The said Marchioness has sent to me to say that by this the king's love and desire towards the said lady was wonderfully increased, and that he had said she had behaved most virtuously, and to show her that he only loved her honourably. He did not intend henceforth to speak with her except in presence of some of her kin, for which reason the king has caused Cromwell to remove from a chamber to which the king can go by certain galleries without being perceived, and has lodged there the eldest brother of the said lady with his wife, in order to bring hither the same young lady who has been well taught for the most part by those intimate with the king, who hate the concubine, that she must by no means comply with the king's wishes, except by way of marriage, in which she is quite firm. She's also advised to tell the king boldly how his marriage is detested by the people, and none consider it lawful, and on the occasion when she shall bring forward the subject, there ought to be present none but titled persons, who will say the same, if the king put them upon their oath of fealty. In April 1536, Cromwell conveyed to the king that he harboured certain suspicions about the Queen. His objective was to charge Anne with offences deserving of divorce or even death, with the aim of turning public sentiment against her and evoking sympathy for Henry. Cromwell took a big gamble by presenting these allegations to Henry. Anne, like her or not, was still his wife and queen. However, driven by his eagerness to pursue a relationship with Jane, forge a Spanish alliance, and satisfy his desire for retribution against a woman who had made grand promises but failed to fulfill them, Henry accepted the accusations against Anne at face value, because it was convenient.
Coincidence? I think not!
He simply asked Cromwell to provide substantiating evidence. Within 2 weeks, Cromwell had found his evidence, while also recovering from an illness.
I'm too weak.
And Anne Boleyn was arrested on the 2nd of May 1536. She was tried and found guilty of several charges, including incest and adultery. Anne was supposed to be executed by beheading on the 18th of May. However, the executioner was delayed, so while Anne was having another mental breakdown in the Tower of London, Jane Seymour, on the other hand, spent the evening at Strand and was already carrying herself as queen in all of her finery. The next morning, on the 19th of May 1536, Anne Boleyn, former Queen of England, was beheaded at the Tower of London. Jane's headspace in May 1536 remains speculative. Being a part of Anne's household, she likely had some inkling that the accusations against Anne might be unjust. However, it is possible that she harboured a belief that Anne deserved a severe punishment, perhaps even death, for her treatment of Catherine and for the religious changes she had supported, changes that Jane appears to have disapproved of. It's highly probable that Jane aspired to become queen and might have genuinely cared for Henry. His considerable charm may have led her to believe that Anne didn't truly understand him, a sentiment not uncommon among women involved with married men. Nevertheless, regardless of her inner emotions, Jane had no control over the trial and execution of Anne. On the day of Anne's execution, Henry chose to wear white, a colour associated with mourning in France, as potentially a sign of reverence for his former queen. He then proceeded directly to Strand, where the echoes of the cannon fire announcing Anne's death could be heard. When Jane was informed of Anne's passing, she appeared rather unconcerned, possibly because she was in the midst of preparing her own wedding and reflecting on the fact that it had taken Anne 7 years to become queen, whereas Jane had achieved the same status in less than 7 months. Within the royal palaces, carpenters, masons and seamstresses were employed to erase Anne's initials wherever they appeared and replace them with Jane's. Portraits of Anne were taken down to make it look as if she never existed. From that point on, the king never spoke of Anne's name again. On the 19th of May 1536, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer issued a dispensation allowing the marriage of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. This dispensation was granted because Jane's grandmother, Elizabeth Neville, was a cousin of Henry's great-grandmother, Cecily Neville, Duchess of York. Archbishop Cranmer therefore permitted Henry VIII and Jane Seymour to marry, despite being distantly related through their common ancestor, King Edward III. The official document reads, "Dispensation by Cranmer to Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, allowing their marriage even though they are related in the 3rd and 3rd degrees of affinity without the need for the publication of bans." It's worth noting that the mention of the 3rd and 3rd degrees of affinity might imply a closer relationship. Jane was in fact a cousin to Mary and Anne Boleyn, both of whom had been involved with Henry romantically. In terms of family ties, Jane was closer to the Boleyns than she was to Henry. A day later, on the 20th of May 1536, Henry once again donned white and issued orders for his daughter Elizabeth to be relocated from Greenwich to Hatfield under the care of Lady Margaret Bryan, where she would be kept out of public view. Henry remained resolute in his stance that he would not reconcile with his daughter Lady Mary until she acknowledged that his marriage to her mother was incestuous, and his role as the supreme head of the Church of England, two things she was unwilling to do. Lady Mary, who had endured 7 years of insecurity and unhappiness, had become a martyr at the age of 20, plagued by headaches, menstrual issues, nervous depression, and other vague ailments, all while still grieving the loss of her mother. However, the news of Anne Boleyn's death had lifted Mary's spirits, as she now harboured hope, with Jane's assistance, of reconciling with her father. Inside the Queen's chambers, Anne Boleyn's falcon badge was replaced by Jane's emblem, a phoenix rising from a castle amidst flames and Tudor roses. Also on that day, Henry and Jane became officially engaged. Days later, on the 30th of May 1536, Henry and Jane were wed by Archbishop Cranmer at Whitehall Palace. Jane's biographer Elizabeth Norton contends that the marriage was initially kept secret for a few days. There was no official announcement. Instead, Jane was gradually presented to the people as queen. Following the wedding ceremony, Jane assumed her role as the queen and, for the first time, took her seat in the Queen's chair beneath the canopy of royal estate. Weir then states that later that day, the king made her a grant of 104 manors in 4 counties, as well as a number of forests and hunting chases for her jointure, the income that would support her during her marriage. As a wedding gift to his new queen, Henry presented a splendid gold cup designed by Hans Holbein, adored with the intertwined initials of the royal couple and a love knot. The Queen's motto was elegantly inscribed on the cup 3 times. Unfortunately for us, in 1625, during the reign of Charles I, the cup was pawned and 4 years later melted down. Contrary to popular belief, Henry and Jane did not embark on a honeymoon to Wolfhall. This misconception stems from a wrongful interpretation of a letter penned by Sir John Russell in early June. During Catherine of Aragon's reign as queen, she maintained a retinue of 168, a number that Anne Boleyn had expanded. Upon Jane's accession to queen, her retinue had grown to 200 members. Her household was sworn in on the 2nd of June, the day that Jane would make her first formal appearance as queen. 2 days later, Jane was proclaimed Queen of England at Greenwich and dined under a cloth of estate. Due to his leg ulcers and Mary's behaviour, Henry became easily irritated, and not the easiest person to live with. No longer able to partake in physical activities, he redirected his free time towards theological and religious matters. He viewed himself as the spiritual father appointed by God to guide his people. He became more pedantic and dogmatic. Very few would dare to argue with him. Privately, he could be impolite, intolerant, critical and harsh, although at times he could be the jovial king he once was. But this side of him was seen less and less as his health declined. When he chose to, he possessed considerable charm and enjoyed flirtations with ladies.
How you doing?
However, following his experiences with Catherine and Anne, he would never allow a woman to have the power to control him again. In June 1536, the Act of Succession was passed. This new Act of Succession made both Mary and Elizabeth illegitimate, although I guess in Mary's case it just confirmed that she was still illegitimate. But it stated that any children Henry and Jane would have would be put ahead of his daughters in the line of succession. It also stated, and I can't help but think He put this in as a fail-safe after the first two marriages, that if Jane failed to produce an issue, Henry was granted the unprecedented power to choose his own successor, which could include the issue of any other lawful wife. On the 7th of January 1536, Jane enters London in state. Compared to Catherine and Anne, Jane's entry into London was fairly low-key, most likely because the king's coffers were running low. Both Catherine and Anne had been crowned within weeks of becoming queen. There is evidence to suggest that Henry had every intention to crown Jane, and had she not died, she probably would have eventually had the ceremony. So let's go back to my pal Eustace Chapuis, who wrote to Charles V on the 19th of May, the day that Anne was executed, about Jane having a coronation, to be celebrated with great solemnity and pomp, the king intending, as I am told, to perform wonders, for he has already ordered a large ship to be built, like the one of Venice, to bring the lady from Greenwich to his city, and commanded other things for the occasion. Henry had even ordered the construction of a high walkway from the Palace of Westminster into the Abbey in preparation for Jane's coronation. We know that the work was stopped by the end of the summer of 1536, as Chapuis wrote in another letter dated on the 1st of July that the coronation had been postponed until after the 29th of September, a feast day known as Michaelmas. It was then thought that her coronation would take place on the 13th of October, St. Edward's Day, but that too was also delayed due to plague. Now, I have speculated that Jane's coronation was postponed due to the cost. I mean, Anne Boleyn's coronation was very expensive. However, Eustace Chapuis speculates that her coronation was postponed until she had proved herself by providing a male heir. He then continues, and if not, and there is danger of her being barren, occasion may be found to take another. I am told on good authority that this king will not have the prize of those who do not repent in marriage, for within 8 days after publication of his marriage, having twice met 2 beautiful young ladies, he said and showed himself somewhat sorry that he had not seen them before he was married. So her coronation never happened. If it had, she would have worn the same crown as her predecessors, an open coronal of heavy gold set with sapphires, rubies and pearls. I would love to show you a picture of it, but Mr. No Fun and No Christmas Allowed Oliver Cromwell had it melted down.
This is why we can't have nice things.
On the 13th of June 1536, Henry's daughter, the Lady Mary, offers her father her submission and signed the articles that decreed that her parents' marriage was illegitimate and that her father is the head of the Church of England. Does this mean that Mary had a change of heart?
No, definitely not.
Mary only did so after Chapuis assured Mary that the Pope absolved her from all responsibility. Henry was still not happy, as he was angry that it had taken Mary so long to agree with him. But he also sent Sir Thomas Wriothesley to ask Mary what ladies she would like in her household. Mary was so grateful that she wrote a letter to Cromwell acknowledging her faults and thanking Cromwell for helping her mend her relationship with her father. This did please Henry, and then he decided that he did want to be a loving father again. How did Jane feel about this? I imagine she was overjoyed at finally some sort of family unit was coming together, as she had also worked on repairing the father-daughter relationship. Jane was also fairly lonely as queen. There were very few ladies in her household that in status were on similar terms to herself, and those whom she had been familiar with, she had separated herself from in order to emphasise her rank as queen. So, it's kind of your own fault, Jane, but whatever. Mary, on the other hand, as the daughter of the king, was of high enough rank that Jane could frequent her stepdaughter's company and entertain a friendship with her.
Our friend, football friend! Oh, best friends forever and ever! Oh, friend!
2 days later, Jane rode beside her husband to Westminster Abbey for the opening of Parliament. The King's niece, Lady Margaret Douglas, carried her train. On the 6th of July, the King and Queen went to Hackney to meet with the Lady Mary. This was the first time that Henry had spoken affectionately of his daughter in 6 years, and was probably quite an emotional reunion. It was reported that the King was gentle and patient. Not much else was heard as they continued the conversation in private. 2 days later, it was announced that Mary would rank as the second lady at court after Jane herself. Now that Mary was back in favour, the eldest Tudor child focused on repairing the relationship between her father and her sister. Despite facilitating a reconciliation between Henry and Mary, Jane had shown very little interest in repairing the relationship between Henry and his youngest daughter, the 3-year-old Elizabeth. But then, why would anyone want to act on the behalf of the bastard of a traitor? Mary's efforts were documented on the 21st of July when she visited her sister at Hatfield, and wrote to their father about how Elizabeth was in good health, and how in time he would be proud of his youngest daughter. The September of 1536 saw the start of the Pilgrimage of Grace, which lasted until the March of 1537. As mentioned earlier, King Henry VIII had initially intended to crown Jane as Queen in October, capitalising on the wealth generated by the dissolution of the monasteries. However, London and Westminster Abbey were struck by plague, leading to the cancellation of the coronation. Instead, the royal couple retreated to Windsor. Another reason it may have been delayed might have been because of the Pilgrimage of Grace rebellion. The Pilgrimage of Grace started with a riot in Louth, Lincolnshire. This riot emerged in the response to the king's religious reforms. As the rebellion gained momentum, it spread to Yorkshire, with rebels eventually occupying York. Robert Aske, a man from York, assumed leadership. The rebel army, bearing banners depicting the 5 wounds of Christ, which is where the rebellion got its name from, viewed their cause as a holy crusade, aiming to convince the king to reconcile with Rome and spare the monasteries. Despite the coronation setback, Jane received a generous jointure as queen, and there was much competition for a place in her household. One day in late October, Jane knelt before King Henry at court, pleading for him to reconsider the fate of the monasteries. His response was silence, but his visible irritation was unmistakable. She implored him to consider restoring some of the smaller monasteries, proposing that the rebellion might be seen as a divine punishment for the destruction of so many churches. Henry, seething with anger, instructed her to divert her attention to other matters. It was said, "Here's the Queen of England said to the king that perhaps God permitted this rebellion for ruining so many churches," to which he replied by telling her to attend to other things, remind her that the last queen had died in consequence of meddling too much with state affairs. However, this information should potentially be taken with a pinch of salt. We are told of this information by Cardinal du Bellay, which in itself is fine, but the last time the Cardinal was in England was in 1534. That's 2 years before the Pilgrimage of Grace. He might have had a spy network, but ultimately he wasn't there. Jane heeded Henry's warning and refrained from further involvement in politics. In December 1536, King Henry let it be known that he would meet Aske's demand, promising, with comfortable words, to send Norfolk north to confirm the agreement. Additionally, he agreed to the rebels' demand for the Queen's coronation to be at York Minster. Aske accepted Henry's assurances with good faith, leading to the disbandment of his army, confident that the king would honour his promise. On the 8th of December 1536, Aske received formal pardon, and by Christmas 1536, Jane Boleyn, the Lady Rochford, returned to the court as Lady of the Bedchamber for the Queen. Most of Anne's previous staff had been retained, resulting in the new Queen's household closely resembling that of Anne's time. Henry, also thought that his wife was pregnant and patted her stomach, saying, "Edward, Edward." Unfortunately for Henry, Jane wasn't pregnant, but it shows that he already knew what his prince would be called. Also, Mary fainted and her father and stepmother had to get her off the floor.
Thought you ought to know.
Thanks to Mary, Elizabeth was invited to court for the Christmas festivities, and the Tudor family was whole again. Henry and Jane sat together at the table, and Jane and Mary sat opposite each other. Elizabeth didn't sit with the adults on the account that she was 3. It was noted that the king was very affectionate towards his youngest daughter during that time. On the 21st of December 1536, Jane's father passed away at Wolfhall. Her father had largely remained out of the public eye. As a result, there was no court mourning. Jane did not attend the funeral, raising the possibility that she might not have been particularly close to her father. In recent years, she had rarely seen him, and there is no record to indicate any significant emotional impact on her part following his death. During the spring of 1537, Queen Jane stood sponsor at the christening of her niece, who also bore the name Jane Seymour. Honestly, the Seymours have like 3 names. Her niece Jane Seymour was the daughter of her brother Edward Seymour and would later go on to be the sole witness at the wedding of Lady Catherine Grey and her brother, who was also named Edward Seymour. See what I mean? I meant Jane Seymour's brother though, not Lady Catherine Grey's brother, because she didn't have one. The Lady Mary and Thomas Cromwell were also in attendance at the christening. By the end of that spring, Jane herself would finally fall pregnant, and by all accounts, it was a pretty normal pregnancy. Her pregnancy was announced in the April, but the Queen had a rather odd craving. Well, by our standards anyway. Jane craved quail eggs. However, these were out of season, and so Henry had to get them shipped from Calais. Lady Lisle, who was in Calais, was desperate to get her daughters a place at court, and Jane essentially agreed to take on one of her daughters in exchange for a supply of quail eggs. Although when supply was low in Calais, they did outsource to Flanders. Lady Lisle sent both of her daughters to England so Jane could choose her favourite to be in her entourage. Jane chose the older sister, Anne Bassett. The younger Bassett, Catherine, joins the household of the Duchess of Suffolk. Jane's main companions during her pregnancy were her sister Elizabeth, who was now the wife of Thomas Cromwell's son Gregory, and her stepdaughter, the Lady Mary. On the 16th of September 1537, Jane Seymour entered her period of confinement at Hampton Court Palace, where she would eventually give birth to her baby. The next day, Anne Bassett was sworn into Jane's service. Anne was a popular figure at court and would even attract Henry's attention. But through all of that, she kept a good reputation. The Queen was not happy with Anne Bassett's style of clothing. Anne had chosen to wear a French hood, a style made popular in England by Anne Boleyn, but this choice did not meet the Queen's approval. She insisted that the French hood had to be replaced, and thus she arranged for a gable hood to be provided instead. The Queen also found Anne's gown unsuitable. Jane requested that Anne obtain 2 new gable hoods with stiffened frontlets, and 2 high-quality gowns made of black velvet and black satin. Furthermore, Jane directed Anne to replace her coarse linen undergarments with ones of fine quality. Finally, Jane learned that there were too few pearls stitched to Anne's girdle. Jane warned her that if she did not appear at court in the proper clothes, she would not be allowed to attend the royal christening when the time came. We know that Henry was a germaphobe, but it seems that Jane might have shared the same trait, as plague ravaged London. Both the King and Queen were afraid, and those who had been to London were not to come to court on the King's order. Your ladyship would not believe how much the Queen is afraid of the sickness. Over the course of 2 days in October, the 7th and the 8th, a new baby joined the family. Henry's niece, Frances Brandon, gave birth to a girl at Bradgate Manor in Leicestershire. She was named Jane after the Queen. While in London, the Duchess of Suffolk gave birth to a boy, named Charles, after his father. The Queen herself, who was heavily pregnant, went into labour on the 9th of October, 1537. Her pregnancy had been pretty smooth sailing, but her labour was far from it, lasting 3 days.
Big blonde sack of drama say what?
Jeez. I'm just tired thinking about it. The baby was finally delivered on the 12th of October, 1537. A boy named Edward.
Breathtaking. I shall call him Mini-Me.
Henry was not with Jane, so when he received the news of the Queen's delivery, he immediately rode to Hampton Court. Edward assumes the title of the Duke of Cornwall from the moment of his birth. However, Henry never actually gave his son the title of Prince of Wales. It is noteworthy that Prince Edward was not the only newborn at Hampton Court Palace on that day. In another part of the palace, Jane's sister-in-law, Lady Beauchamp, Anne Stanhope, also gave birth to a son named Edward. Due to concerns about the plague, Henry VIII ensured that his son Edward's apartments were meticulously cleaned with soap and swept daily. Jane likely had limited contact with her son following his birth, as he had his own separate apartments and household. In contrast to Anne Boleyn, Jane did not make a fuss about nursing her own child. Instead, in keeping with tradition, she stayed in her bedchamber, attending to the task of signing letters to announce the birth to foreign courts. On the 15th of October 1537, Edward's christening took place at the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court. The godparents were Thomas Cranmer, the Duke of Norfolk, Duke of Suffolk, and the Lady Mary. The Lady Elizabeth was also part of the procession, being carried by Lord Beauchamp, Edward Seymour, the Queen's brother, while clutching the chrysobal tightly in her tiny fists. After the christening and the naming of Edward as heir, he was returned to the Queen's apartments, accompanied by his 2 sisters. This time Elizabeth walked alongside Mary, holding her hand. Jane was wrapped in furs, and then carried to a daybed. It is important to note that parents typically did not attend christening during this era. Shortly afterwards, Jane developed a fever, and just 2 days later, she was administered the last rites. Despite a brief period of improvement, her condition once again deteriorated. One of the courtiers wrote of this unfortunate turn of events. "If good prayers can save her, she is not like to die, for never lady was so much plained, with every man, rich and poor." On the 23rd of October 1537, Henry had originally planned to leave Hampton Court ready for the hunting season. However, due to Jane's condition, which had worsened since Edward's christening, he found it impossible to leave her in such a state. Instead, Henry chose to remain by Jane's side throughout the evening and into the night. Tragically, the next day, on the 24th of October, Jane quietly passed away in her sleep. The prospect of death deeply disturbed Henry, and he fled to Windsor. He couldn't bear to stay in the same residence as Jane's lifeless body. Consequently, the Duke of Norfolk was left to handle the arrangements for Jane's funeral. Henry retreated into seclusion while staying at Windsor, refusing all visitors. When Henry finally emerged from his isolation, his ministers cautiously broached the idea of a 4th marriage, emphasising its importance for the stability of the realm. To their surprise, Henry readily agreed. Perhaps, being a spare himself, he realised the need of 2 sons. Jane's body lay in state at the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court, while her entrails were buried. Her lifeless body was dressed in a robe made of golden tissue, complete with a crown upon her head, with some of her jewels. Among Henry VIII's wives, Jane Seymour was the sole one to die while holding the title of Queen, earning her a royal funeral held at Windsor. Eventually, she was joined by the King, who had requested to be buried beside the mother of his sole surviving son. We think that at the time of her death, Jane was 29 years old, as she had 29 ladies walking in her funeral procession. This was traditionally done to mark the age of those who died. This suggests her birth date to have fallen between October 1507 and October 1508. Her stepdaughter, the Lady Mary, was chief mourner. Her body was finally buried at Windsor Castle on the 12th of November 1537. Thank you for watching today's video on King Henry VIII's third wife and queen, Jane Seymour, and the mother of the final Tudor king. If you enjoyed today's video, be sure to leave a thumbs up and make sure you subscribed if you haven't already. And I will see you in the next one. Have a wonderful day.